Welcome, everybody. This is the third week of the course on markets under critics. Today we will have Ivan Luzardo. He's a fellow at the Department of Economics here at Penn and a fellow in the Penn Initiative for the Study of Markets, and he will be presenting on market instability. As always, you can type your questions in the box in Zoom, or you can make your questions to us through mail, and we will make our efforts to answer you. So without much ado, go ahead, Ivan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernando, and thank you very much for the opportunity. So thank you very much for the opportunity. The fundamental question for this lecture is, are markets stable? I think that this is a very important question. Why? Because a lot of the discussion about the benefits and the problems associated with markets, market economy, is related with the stability of the market. Some people think markets are positive. There are a lot of benefits associated with markets, but what about the stability? So maybe stability is a problem, or the costs associated with instability are very high that increase the implementation of a market economy. So I think for that reason, so it's important to understand what are the sources of instability or stability in the market. And I would like to start this lecture with this quote by Irving Fisher. So he was a very famous economist with a lot of influence during his time. And even a great economist as Fisher, so have this wrong prediction about the Great Depression. So let's see this quote. He basically say 1 week before the big crash of 1929, the stock prices have reached what it looks like a permanent high plateau. So basically, he was forecasting a lot of stability just a week before the big crash of the Depression. So of course, we know that Fisher was wrong about this. So he had a good intuition about many topics in economics, but he was particularly wrong about his prediction about the evolution of the market 1 week before the 1929 big crash. So even for a good economist like Fisher, so it's not easy to predict what is going on in the market, and it seems like markets have a fundamental characteristic, and it has that characteristic is that they could be unstable sometimes. So this is the outline for our lecture today. So initially we will see a little bit of the business cycle. So what business cycle actually means, so how the theory of business cycles evolved and why it started to be more widespread accepted in the early 20th century. Then we will have 2 additional sessions. So the first of those additional sessions is about financial crisis, why we have financial crisis, why they are so relevant, which are the implications in the discussion of the economic policy that followed after financial crisis. And finally, we will talk about technology and the so-called real shocks. Basically, when we are talking about real shocks, basically, we are differentiating that kind of shocks from monetary shocks that are more associated with monetary policy or with the financial market. So this is the outline for our lecture today. So let's start with business cycle. And the first thing of all, when we are analyzing a business cycle, is to see the evolution of the income per capita, or total income for a country. So we want to see if that time series of GDP is stable, or if we can see fluctuations like is the case, for instance, for the United Kingdom since the mid-19th century. So we can see that since 1850 up to the mid-20th century, the trend for the income per capita um, is positive. So we can see that the income per capita grew in a matter of 100 years. But we can see also a lot of fluctuations. So even that the pattern is positive, we can see that in some periods we have recession. So that means that we have a negative evolution of the GDP. We can see, for instance, in 1893, so the so-called the Baring crisis, a very famous one in financial history. So we can see the negative impact of that crisis here in the late 19th century. But broadly speaking, we can see that the fluctuations in the late 19th century were more limited than in the 20th century. So in the 20th century, we see um, a, a large, an important recession in 1929, in that a crisis that followed with the end of the First World War. And of course, we can see the Great Depression here. So basically, the takeaway from this picture is that fluctuations, business cycle, we cannot survey that since the 19th century, but it seems like the recessions or the depression of the early 20th century were larger than those from the late 19th century. And for that reason, the discussion and the theory about business cycle, as you can see, as you can, of course, predict, will be more intense during the interwar period and in the early 20th century. So let's see now the series for the United States. We can see an acceleration of economic growth in the late 19th century, basically the period after the American Civil War. But even that strong economic performance from the late 19th century, even in that context, we can see fluctuations and we can see business cycles. So some years the economy does good, other years the economy does bad. Sometimes we have an acceleration in economic growth. Sometimes we have a moderation, and other times we have recession. So we can see a lot of fluctuations in that thing. Of course, the most important of those fluctuations will be the Great Depression. So you can see that how large the Great Depression was as a crisis relative to other crises, like, for instance, the crisis in 1907, we have a financial crisis. Also in 1973, so there was a panic related with railroads, but the outcome is essentially the same that we have for the United Kingdom. So basically, we have a lot of fluctuations, but the intensity of those fluctuations were more intense in the early 20th century. So it seems like some characteristics, some particular characteristics from the early 20th century made recessions worse than in the late 19th century. Okay, so we in order to understand the reasons, the cause behind recession, so usually we associate that with the so-called shocks, basically that force that disturbs the long-run equilibrium, and basically is the reason that generated the recession or the crisis. So basically, economists differentiate into two kinds of shocks. There is what the economists call the monetary shocks. That is basically some balance, for instance, in the financial market or in the monetary policy or in the management of the money supply that can create a financial bubble and eventually a financial crisis. So we'll talk later more about that. And there is the what the economists call a real shock, basically something that is structural, so it's not the monetary system, it's not the financial sector, is that something real is leading to the um, the decline in the GDP. So of course we can have some example of the real shocks. So we will talk later about that. But for instance, wars, instability, in an increase in the input costs. For instance, if oil experiences an increase, so of course that can have a negative impact on the aggregate economy. So that kind of shows that are not related with the financial system. So it's what we call real talk. So we will talk more about that. Okay, the interwar period is fundamental to understand the consolidation of a theory about business cycle. And as I mentioned before, this is related with the intensity of the business cycle during this period. So unlike the late 19th century, we can describe this period of the span between the end or between the start of the First World War and the end of the Second World War, like a period of deglobalization. The globalization not only in terms of international trade, but also in the financial market. So capital markets was not as integrated like it was during the first era of globalization in the late 19th century. So the globalization was an important characteristic of this period. So maybe, or some people think that that was a reason why the management of the recession of the crisis was more difficult during the interwar period than during the late 19th century. That is something that we need to bear in mind. Also, during the interwar period, we have essentially 2 years. So we have acceleration of economic growth in the 1920s, and we have, of course, a complicated era in the 1930s. So basically, in the decade that started with the Great Depression. Another important characteristic of the interwar period and very associated with the globalization is the collapse of the interwar gold standard. So, in order to have a bit of context of this period of the late 19th century, also the so-called ephemeral globalization, a fundamental instrument that allowed integration between countries was the gold standard. So the gold standard has certain preconditions like cooperation between countries. It has some benefits like because facilitate international trade, but it seems like those preconditions that allow with the performance or the adoption of the gold standard during the late 19th century, they were not present anymore during the interwar period. So we have the collapse of the interwar period that, of course, occurred in the context of the Great Depression. This is just a figure to reinforce this argument about the globalization that one of the reasons why crisis recessions were more intense during the interwar period, it was because the lack of cooperation between the main economic powers and also that context of the globalization. So what we can see is how international trade decreased between 1929 and 1932. So basically what you have is an spiral where there is a decline in the volume of trade because the recession, and countries reacted to that by increasing tariffs, and that led to an additional to a further decline in international trade. So, and of course, that made the situation even worse. So, crisis, very important. The Great Depression, very important in the context of the interwar economy. in all the discussion about the fundament of the business cycle. And of course, we will have an important imbalance here that will be unemployment. So behind those periods of recessions, of course, a consequence that that came with those recession is unemployment. And unemployment will be an important topic in the discussion about economic policy during the interwar period. So this is a picture of the Euro crusade. So this is just to illustrate the problem of the mass unemployment in this case in the United Kingdom. So Euro is a town in the north of England that used to be very prosperous during the late 19th century, in the period of globalization or during the Victorian era, and during the interwar period, it was affected by mass unemployment. This is just a map to see the intensity of unemployment in the United Kingdom at the time. You can see regions like Wales, where unemployment was over 25% in 1930. So even that 1930, so that, we are not still in the peak of unemployment as a result of the of the Great Depression. So the peak of unemployment in the case of the United Kingdom will be in 1932. And but you can see that the level of the level of the depression was very high. So we are talking about no banking panic that was the common kind of shocks, the common kind of crisis that we have in the 19th century. So it seems like what we are talking about in the context of the Great Depression, it was another level, another scale of a crisis. So let's see the case of the United States. So we can see here the evolution of unemployment between the mid 1920s and 1942. And you can see that during the 20s, so, the economy did very good. Basically, we call this period like the roaring 20s, just to illustrate how prosperous, how positive was the economic performance of the United States at the time. But of course, we have a massive increase of unemployment during the Great Depression. So after 1929, we have a problem of mass unemployment that lasted for almost a decade. Another important characteristic of the Great Depression is not just the intensity of the crisis, but also the duration of the crisis. So it was a crisis that lasted almost a decade. So it was not just that, it was a crisis very intense, but the recovery was quick. It was a crisis that lasted for several years. And for that, made very painful the adjustment. So in the case of the United States, we have 2 series for unemployment because there is no consensus about the definition of employment for this period. So basically, this author or Levergo, the series in blue. So basically, he considered as unemployed the workers that were under the emergency program of the New Deal. So basically, those unemployed that were employed by the government of the New Deal programs, and they're being considered those workers like active workers or employees. So he didn't call them as unemployed. So we have for that reason 2 series of unemployment according to the definition that we prefer to use. Okay, the Great Depression, the intensity of the crisis in the early 20th century will lead to an important and profound discussion about the fundamentals of the market economy. Why? Because the Great Depression, the all unemployment created because that crisis will have an impact in the in the view about the stability of the market. So basically, in the period before that, so remember we are talking about the context of the first era of globalization, the most important policy of that globalization is the gold standard, and regardless the fluctuation, the business cycle during the period. So the crises were not so intense to lead to a debate about the stability of the market economy. So it was in the context of the Great Depression. It was in the context of all the problems that we can observe during the interwar economy. We have mentioned it here, the case of the United Kingdom and the case of the United States, but the accumulation of problems during the interwar period, of course, were larger. So we have not mentioned it here. The hyperinflation in the case of Germany, and also the whole economic situation in Western Europe. So all that will lead to challenge the consensus view about the evolution of the market economy, and of course the main character of that um, one important player in that discussion, of course, will be Keynes. So Keynes will question it, the consensus view, what he called the classic view of the economy about the market stability, and in the Keynesian view, unemployment is the evidence, is the proof that there was a fundamental imbalance in the market economy. So that will be very, very important. So let's review very briefly the Keynes argument. So basically, Keynes takes an intuition, a notion originally posed by Malthus about this concept of the effective demand. So basically, they differentiate the potential demand. So basically, that would be like the capacity of an economy to produce goods and services until a certain level, from the effective demand that is what is actually observed. So Keynes will see unemployment as an evidence that the effective demand was below his potential. So remember the context of the interwar period, the problem of mass unemployment in Britain. So what Keynes observed is a lot of factories, for instance, in the north of England, that they are operating below his potential, below his capacity. So under use of resource is a problem, according to Keynesian view, that is an evidence that markets are operating below his potential, and that there is a structural imbalance in the economy. So for the classical solution for recessions in the fluctuation of the economy was essentially a self-correction. So because remember that we cannot understand the era or the first era of globalization, or the first wave of globalization from the late 19th century, without understand the classical gold standard. So under the classical gold standard, there is a self-correction mechanism. So because that self-correction mechanism was not operating during the interwar period, so that opened the question, that put the question why we cannot have the same outcome as it was the case for the recession, the crisis of the late 19th century. So the thing is that self-correction mechanism worked in the context of the 19th century, because we are talking about economies characterized by a large flexibility in prices and wages. So the situation was completely different during the interwar period. So that self-correction mechanism is contingent to flexibility in prices and wages. And that was not what we have during the interwar period. And what if we have no that level of flexibility in terms of price and wage? So it seems like we are in a different situation, and of course this is what Keynes was observing during the interwar period. So according to Keynes, the national income is the same to the national expenditure. So it's just an equivalence. So if we can observe unemployment, so that means that the national income is below his potential. So the way to restore equilibrium in that context is by an stimulus in the aggregate demand. So basically, to increase the the total economy, to try to stimulate the economy via an increase of the public expenditure. So the public expenditure was a way to counterbalance the reduction in investment and in consumption. And we cannot wait until the set correction because the situation, the context was very different from that of the late 19th century or the the first era of globalization. So basically, this is the Keynes argument that makes a lot of sense in the context of the interwar period. Actually, will be there will be a relative consensus of the Keynesian view of macroeconomics in the decades that followed the World War II. In the 50s and the 60s will be like the peak of the Keynesian influence on the economy. But of course, there are also critiques to the Keynesian economics, and those critiques will gain relevance, will be more important in the second half or in the late 20th century. Basically, after 1973, we will see why after that year that we can see the oil, the so-called oil shock, the influence of the Keynesian economy will tend to decline. So some critiques very briefly of the Keynesian economies. The Keynesian economies don't uh, doesn't say a lot about productivity. So what about productivity? So is no the economic performance related with productivity. We will see. We will come back to that discussion at the end of this lecture. And also, I think that the fundamental reason why the Keynesian economy, the Keynesian economics lost relevance in the late 20th century was because the so-called disinflation. So basically, this disinflation is when we have at the same time inflation and unemployment. So the Keynes prediction is that if we increase the public expenditure, so we should observe inflation, but the the benefit of that is that we will see a reduction in unemployment. But basically, the conclusion is that we can have um, low inflation at the expense of low unemployment, or we can have a high unemployment at expense of sorry, or we can have a high inflation at the expense of um, low unemployment, or we can achieve um, a control of prices. We can achieve low inflation, but the price of that will be high unemployment. So the thing with inflation that we will start to see in the 70s is that we have at the same time high inflation and high unemployment. So there is no an evident answer in the Keynesian economics for that situation. And finally, there is this critique that came with the development of the public choice theory that is that the Keynesian economy recommend the counter-cyclical policies. So basically, that means that governments should stimulate the economy via increasing the public expenditure during the bad times, so during the recessions. But in order to have the resource to increase the public expenditure, they should save during the good times. So basically, when they are in an economic boom, so it's supposed that government should save for in order to have resource for to increase the expenditure during the recession. But what is the ability of governments to maintain that credible commitment? So it seems like it's very difficult to search in practicality that governments maintains low deficit policy even if the economy is doing very well. So this is just some figures to give you a little bit of context of for those critiques about stagflation. So we can see that in the 70s and in the 80s, so we have a period of high unemployment in the case of the United States, and at the same time, so we have a period of high inflation. So this is the so-called phenomena of stagflation. And this is a series that displays the evolution of the federal government surplus of deficit since the mid 20th century. And basically, what we can observe is that in most of the case, government is running, or particularly after the 70s, running a fiscal deficit, even in periods where the economy is doing relatively well. So, see, for instance, that we have here a period of fiscal surplus in the early 21st century, but notice that even when the economy was recovering from the 2001 crisis, so still the fiscal deficit was high. Of course, we have an increase in the fiscal deficit after the Great Recession in 2008, and even that there was a reduction, so it's very difficult to maintain that commitment to generate surpluses during the periods where the economy is doing well. Just two additional comments on the consolidation of the business cycle theory during the interwar period in the early 20th century. So the first is that discussion about analyzing the reason of the financial crisis, the patterns in the business cycle fluctuation, also occurred at the same time where it was where we observed an important increase in the government size and the consolidation of the welfare state. So this is a picture of William Beveridge. So he was an important character in the consolidation of the welfare state in the United Kingdom. And of course, he was very aware of the situation of unemployment. So unemployment has not just a ramification in the economic theory, but also in practical economic policy. And of course, one of that important consequence was the consolidation of the welfare state. So this is the very famous, the Beveridge report. So it was an study about the social condition of the population in the United Kingdom that is basically worked as a fundament for the welfare state in that country. The second comment is that we will see a formalization of the theory of business cycle later in the century. And I think that an important character in understanding that formalization is these economists that won the Nobel Prize in 1969, Ronald Frisch. Frisch is important because some people call him like the father of econometrics. So he will be very important in the formalization of all that theories that were probably a description of the observation, the intuition of the economists during the interwar period. But Frisch will formalize all that in a more quantitative approach. And related with that, it's important to bear in mind that the relevance of a business cycle led to a better a better observation of that. So basically, because of all the recession, the crisis that we mentioned for the interwar period, so that led to a greater concern about having a record of the evolution of the aggregate of the total economy. And we will see during the interwar period the consolidation of the national accounts. For us, is very obvious that when we can see how good, how bad an economy is doing, so we immediately observe the evolution of the GDP. But in order to have that statistics, so we need to have information. So basically, we need to gather a lot of information about how different industries, how different sectors in the economy are doing, and we need to aggregate that in national accounts. And that was also an important development during the interwar period. So Sigmund Kuznets will be like the pioneer in gathering all that information in the case of the United States. So we will see that his work at the National Bureau of Economic Research between 1919 and 1935, like the key period for consolidating the information of the national account for the United States. So then similar for the United Kingdom, it's observed in 1941. So we need to consider the countries of World War II, and also the necessity to have information about resources and how good the economy was doing. Okay, so that's the first part of the lecture. So once we have this idea about a business cycle, also we want to explore more about if those fluctuations can be explained because the performance of the financial sector, of the financial market. So several of the recession, depression are also financial crisis. So I think that is positive, is important to have some general ideas about why we have financial crisis. So this is just a recommendation for if you wanted to explore more about the history of financial crisis. So I encourage you to take a look to these classes. So Kinderberger will be like the pioneer in gathering a description of the history of financial crisis. I think that you will find a lot of interesting information there if you are particularly interested in this topic. Okay, the discussion about financial crisis, business cycle, even that we mentioned before that will be mainly formalized during the 20th century. The intuition were even from the classical economists, so from the classical economists, or even all the time, so observers have been aware that the the that financial crisis can lead to recessions, and that markets have and the disability of the market is an important topic. So I wanted to highlight this quote by Adam Smith from the Wealth of Nations. So he's I think that we have a lecture a couple of weeks ago about Adam Smith when we see him like his main theory and thought. But even from the very beginning of the economic analysis, we can I'll say that with the word of Adam Smith, we can see that he was aware about this problem of financial crisis, our business cycle. So he mentioned it in book 4 of the Wealth of Nations, overtrading like the main reason, the main explanation for financial crisis. So he, being that he was in favor of the market economy, he observed that in some specific periods there were very high expectation about the future performance of the economy that led to merchants and businessmen to have very high expectation and even to overtrade, basically to overinvest in some business in some sector that and that investment were not supported by the economic fundamentals. So let's explore now the different stage of a financial crisis. So this is of course an oversimplification, but it's just to have a roadmap about how financial crisis occurred. And the first stage is an opportunity to invest. So usually what happened in the different stages of financial crisis is that at the very beginning, so investors or the public identify a potential opportunity to invest, and there is an excessive reaction. So there is an over valuation of the potential return of that investment. Sometimes it's because there is very limited information about that opportunity to invest. For instance, if we are talking about a new technology, so it seems like the potential application of that technology could be very positive assessed in a specific period. We have several examples of that in economic history. For instance, railroads. Also, there were several railroads manias during the 19th century. Basically, very high expectation about the returns of the new technology. But also, the opportunity to invest could be any financial asset. So it could be commodities, it could be invest in the sovereign debt of another country, in the real estate. So basically any financial asset. The second stage is that as I mentioned before, a necessary reaction to that investment opportunity, and that reaction will involve an extension of credit. So of course, because if I am an investor and I think that I have a very good investment opportunity, I want to invest not just my saving, but also maybe I want to borrow a little bit just to because I know that the rate of return, if it's very positive, it could be that is higher than the interest rate that I am paying for that credit, for that loan. So extension of credit will be important in the escalation of the financial crisis. There is an additional stage. So this is what some observers call the speculation. So basically, this is when you lost the connection between the fundamentals and the the value of the investment. Basically, during the speculation stage, what you see is that unlike the initial stage where I am doing a good assessment or where I am doing an assessment about the future payment of that investment opportunity, or I basically am assessing in a very positive way the potential return, for instance, of given technology. During the speculation, I am just observing the price, the current price of the particular asset. So I am not considering the fundamentals. So I am not thinking if the railroads will generate profits because it's connecting important markets, because or it's because is allowing the mobilization of a key commodity. And you say, okay, I'm not serving the price of railroad shares. So I think that this is a good investment. So I am just betting that price will continue increasing. There is a new stage, the distress. So basically, when some investor realize that asset pricing is not connected with the fundamentals, so the most informed investors realize that there have been an overinvestment in that particular asset. And of course, there is a final stage when the general public, not just the good informed investor, becomes aware that basically what they are observing is a financial bubble. There are different types of financial crisis. So this is like just as the general pattern evolves. Of course, the kind of financial crisis is very diverse. So just describing here what I think that are the most important ones. A common or a relatively common financial market crisis is a crash in the stock market. So that is known. Um, Sometimes policymakers don't think that this is a really serious crisis because that involves only investors that take part in the financial market and not the general public. A more serious crisis is when we have a banking crisis. So when we have a banking run or when the banking system collapse. So this is another kind of financial crisis. We can have also problems in government, basically in the government ability to repay its debt. This is what we call the sovereign debt crisis. And there is another kind of crisis that is what we call the currency crisis. This is mainly common in developing countries that they have with currencies. So a currency crisis is that there is a strong devaluation in the price of a given currency, and it's basically because there is a change in the expectation of investors about that country. This is not common in advanced economies in um, in countries like the US, but is relatively common in developing countries. So we will see a lot of currency crisis in Latin America, for instance. We have what we call the twin crisis, that is basically a combination between a banking crisis and a currency crisis. And finally, we have what we call the systemic crisis, when you have all the parts of the financial system are collapsing. So this is like the worst case scenario. Have like basically a collapse of the different elements that compose the financial um, industry or the financial sector. So this is just a newspaper that basically circulated uh, in the afternoon, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle circulating in the afternoon during the period of the Great Depression. And this is just basically to illustrate that in 1929, where the Great Depression was not still a recession or a depression. So basically, the Great Depression will become a serious crisis just as in 1931, when escalated from a crash in the stock market to a banking crisis. We start to see that several banks, particularly in the Midwest, collapsed. That the crisis became a serious one. And I just have this picture of this newspaper just to illustrate um, that the that on the news. So of course they are reporting that there was a panic in Wall Street, but you can see several other news. You can see, for instance, this news that Hollywood fire destroyed fields that were millions, and you just see different news. So basically, the public was aware that something serious happened, but that have not the scale that the Great Depression will achieve months or years later. So we are still probably here in a stock market crisis. This is what I mentioned before. So we can see an escalation of the Great Depression in 1931. So basically what we have here is the number of suspensions, so basically the number of bands that failed between 1921 and 1936. And you can see that the number was very low in the 20s, and there was an increase particularly in 1931. So basically, this was the key year in understanding the escalation of the depression. Of course, we will have a second round of banking failures in 1933, and also that also made the situation even worse. So this is just to mention that even when we're talking about financial crisis, so there are different kind of crises and also different levels. Okay, also about understanding the nature of the financial crisis. So usually when we are analyzing crisis, we wanted to differentiate if we are talking about a crisis of liquidity or a crisis of solvency. So that will make the situation very different. So when we are talking about a problem of liquidity, so basically we are talking about the inability of a government, an investor, a bank to meet the financial obligations in the short term. Basically, if I am a government and I eventually can repay, for instance, my debt, the sovereign debt. I can have in the short run a problem of liquidity. I have no the money right now, but eventually I can repay you if the bondholders give me a little bit of time. So this is a no very serious crisis in the sense that it's not as terrible like if I have a problem of solvency. So if I have a problem of liquidity, basically what I need is access to credit. So I need to maybe ask for additional loans just to have a little bit more of time, to or basically to repay now. And basically what I need is a little bit of time. So this is when we have a problem of liquidity. So I cannot meet my financial obligations in the short run, but structurally, I have the capacity to repay for my debt. A problem of solvency is a structural problem, and this is when a crisis is very serious. When I have a problem of solvency, that means that I have structurally an inability to repay for my debt. So basically, I cannot meet my financial obligation in the long term. So structurally, I have a problem. And of course, the adjustment and the solution for a solvency is more painful. Also, in the discussion about the nature of the crisis, so we can differentiate, or some people differentiate the so-called the fundamental causes of the crisis from the self-fulfilling crisis. So when the fundamental cause is when there is for instance, an structural problem. So you have a problem of solvency. For instance, you overinvest in a project that structurally was not generating the level of return that justify that investment. And the difference with the self-fulfilling crisis is when expectations make the situation even worse. For instance, if a group of investors believe that the price of a currency in a developing country will decline, so they can withdraw the investment. Also, what we will see is a capital outflows from that country, and that will create the depreciation. So basically, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'm going to go very quickly over this part of the lecture, but basically, this is just to mention that the observation of financial crises, even that they are not as large like the Great Depression, also have implication in the discussion about the public policy. So we mentioned it before, how the unemployment during the interwar period led to the consolidation of the welfare state. For instance, in the United Kingdom, something similar happened with banking panics during the 19th century in the United States. So basically, we will see the occurrence of several banking panics in the 19th century. Of course, that create the 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 atmospheres, so the the context for having a discussion about the necessity to have a central bank to prevent from instability of the market in the management of banking panics. So this is just an illustration of different banking panics. So during the 19th century, the banking panic of 1873, banking panic of 1893. So this is the so-called the Paris crisis, and of course the banking panic of 1907. This is the San Francisco earthquake, or that started with the San Francisco earthquake of that year. So as a result of that accumulation of banking panics during the 19th century, so there was a discussion about the necessity or the convenience to have a central bank. The main uh, theories for central banking is this character that we can see here. So Walter Bayhot. So basically, he analyzed it in his famous book, Lombard Street, the history of the Bank of England and how the Bank of England worked as a lender of last resort, and that prevent from a painful adjustment in the context of banking panics or financial crisis. So Bayhot established like the fundamentals of central banking that is basically observed by almost all serious central banks across the world. And it's basically a combination between an intervention as a lender of last resort in the case of panic, but also an intervention with some conditions. And for instance, Bayhot established that a central bank provision of credit should be only against good collateral, basically in bailing out a bank. So the central banker also need to assess the quality of the collateral. So basically, this is what we call in macroeconomics a problem of adverse selection. So basically, the central banks want to differentiate a solvent bank that can have a lot of liquidity from an insolvent bank, and bail out only the solvent bank that is experiencing a problem of liquidity. Also, Bayhol establishing that the central bank intervention needed to have a price. So, yeah, and that price needed to be high in order to prevent moral hazard. So, that was essentially the what we call the Bayhol doctrine for central banking. Okay, let's now talk about two additional crises. So, we made this is essentially the relatively common crisis that we observed in the context of the 19th century, so the banking panics. Also, we have the sovereign debt crisis. So, sovereign debt crisis is, as I mentioned before, when government have not the resource to repay for for his external or internal debt. And of course, we have a relatively recent example in the case of Greece and the Eurozone crisis of 1912. So basically, I'm sure you remember, in 2012, there was a lot of discussion about the situation, the economic situation in Greece, and basically there was basically some doubts about the Greek government ability to repay his debt, and we can observe that concerns in the evolution of the interest rate of the government bonds. So basically, if we have an increase in the interest rate, so that means that the public is worried about the repayment of the debt, and for that reason, they are charging an additional price to lend into that country. So we can see here in the red line the evolution of the interest of the government bond for the case of Germany, and in green the interest rates of the government bond for the case of Greece. So basically, this gap, this spread, is explaining essentially for the difference in expectation. Of course, Germany is a very solvent country, so nobody is worried that that Germany will be was able to repay for his debt in 2012. So this is why the interest is basically very close to zero. This is the nominal interest. So probably if we include inflation, so this is probably even below zero. And you can see the gap. So basically, there is a lot of uncertainty in the case of Greece, and an assessment completely different in the case of Germany. And of course, this is the problem associated with the with the Greece ability to repay. The reason behind that crisis is associated with the adoption of the euro as a common currency in the eurozone. So it seems like the adoption of the common currency in economies with different level of development, with different financial sectors, led to a completely change in the pattern for foreign investment. So basically, after 2000, so the year when the euro was adopted, so what we can observe is an increase in Germany investment in Germany investment in other countries within the eurozone, and an increase in the capital inflow in the countries in what we call the peripheral part of Europe. So basically, we have countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal, that they start to receive a lot of capital inflows as a result to the adoption of the common currency. Notice that before the crisis, the interest rate were very similar. So even that Germany and Greece have very different economic structures and probably very different ability to repay his debt. So investors were assessing that Greece or the Greece government was as solvent as the German one. So it was only after the crisis started in first the 2008 the Great Recession in the United States that reduced the liquidity in international capital markets, but mainly after 2010 that investors started to be concerned about the Greece government ability to repay. So it seems like the common currency played a role that it basically, uh, unto a certain extent, um, eliminate the association between the quality of government or the government ability to repay this debt from the price to receive that debt. So basically, this is why we see the decline in the interest rate and the large increase in foreign investment, particularly in investment from the north of Europe. Of course, that crisis so was very profound, so I don't want to go over the details of that crisis, how it was managed, how it evolved, but it seems like it had long-lasting consequences, and the main long-lasting consequence is that after the crisis, Greece went into a process of economic divergence from Germany, that we can consider Germany as the economy of reference in the case of Europe. So you can see that before the crisis, so Greece was converging with Germany. So it's starting from relative income per capita of around 50%. And in his peak, in around 2010, achieved around 70%. But from that point onwards, what we see is some important economic divergence. So it is another important characteristic of financial crisis that sometimes it have long-lasting or almost permanent consequences. Okay, another example of financial crisis, I'm going to go very fast on this, is the Latin American sovereign debt crisis in the 1980s. And basically, what you have is something that is more systemic. So it's not just a sovereign debt crisis, it's also a banking crisis, it's a currency crisis. And that crisis was followed by um, a phenomenon of hyperinflation in some countries, so that made the situation worse. So this is basically an example of this last kind of financial crisis. So this is like the worst case scenario when you have everything is collapsing, the systemic crisis. So I think that the Latin America sovereign crisis is an example of that. And basically, I don't want to go over the details of that crisis, but what you have here is something that was more structural, and what you have here is an economic depression. So that was a crisis that lasted for almost 20 years in some countries. So what you have is an stagnation in in the last 2 decades of the 20th century in those countries. And of course, it was in that context that some Latin American countries implemented structural reforms in the 1990s. So this, just to give you an example about the intensity of that crisis. So this is the GDP per capita relative to that of the United States. So basically, we have here in the black bar is for the year 1928. So you can see that, for instance, Argentina was around 42% of the income per capita of the United States. But in 1990, so where you can see is an important divergence. So it was just 30%. So this is basically just to illustrate the level of stagnation and the level of economic decline in the case of Latin America as a result of the financial crisis. This is just to made the comparison even worse. So if we contrast Latin America, not with the United States, but with South Korea that accelerated his economic growth in the late 20th century. So you can see that before the crisis in 1928, Argentina was richer than South Korea. Even countries less prosperous like Colombia was slightly richer than South Korea, but the situation was completely different in the 90s. So in the 90s, so except Venezuela, all other countries in 1990 have income per capita below South Korea. Okay, this is basically just to illustrate that an important reason in splendid crisis was the level of expenditure of the state-owned enterprises that basically have there was something structural in that crisis, and that explains why what you have is a systemic crisis. But I think that the main takeaway here is that crisis also have implication in not only the pain, the adjustment, how painful the adjustment is, but also in the economic policy or the reforms that are implemented after that. So because we have a very painful crisis in the 1980s in Latin America, so that create the conditions for structural reforms in the 1990s. Because we have that very painful adjustment in the case of Greece. So because the sovereignty crisis in the case of Greece was so intense, you have that process of economic divergence after 2010. Okay, in the final part of this lecture, I would like to talk about what we call the real shocks. Basically, the first kind of shock that we mentioned were financial crises that are related with the monetary system. So in the last 10 minutes of this lecture, so I would like to talk about the real shocks and the technological disruption. And just to present some example of what a real shock actually means is basically that it's something structural, something that is fundamentally changing the nature of the interaction in a market economy. Of course, the canonical example for a real shock is a war. So a war changed the trade patterns. So basically, what you have is an increase in upon uncertainty, sometimes reallocation of resources. So what you have is a lot of disruptions. This is just an example that real shocks that are associated with recessions or with crises. So we have, for instance, the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century, the Spanish-American War of Independence. So we know that Latin American economies did very bad. So it was a period of economic decline and stagnation the early 19th century. And also this is related with all the problems associated with the War of Independence. But we mentioned before the interwar period, so the First World War and World War II. So they basically create a lot of stress on the economy. And of course, that was they were important shots. And of course, the 1973 oil crisis. So we will see why that crisis was very important also to challenge the Keynesian view of the economy. So relatively easy way to see the real shot is to think in a pre-industrial economy. So in an economy where the agricultural sector is the most important one. So we have, for that purpose, for instance, the series of the GDP per capita for England during the Middle Age, and you can notice that between 1252 and 1450, there is a relative stagnation. So this is what we expect. Basically, there's an increase here in after the Black Death because you have a reduction in the population. But basically, what you expect from a pre-industrial economy is an stagnation, and that stagnation came with a lot of variability. So basically, you see a lot of fluctuation, and of course, what explains that fluctuation is the weather, because we are talking about an agricultural economy. The performance of that agricultural production is associated with the weather. So if the weather favor a good crop, or you have a good season in the agricultural production, so that means you have an increase in the agricultural output. So if you have terrible weather, so that means that you will have a contraction in the output. Of course, the 1973 oil shock was very important because oil is an important input for the economy. So if you have an increase in the input cost, so that means that that will have a negative impact on other sectors of the economy. So this is just to illustrate, this is a petrol station in 1973. So how the scarcity of oil was affecting not only companies, but also even the general public. So this theory of business cycles that are explaining for real reasons, I think that was very well developed by those two Nobel Prize, Edward Prescott and Finn Kinlan. So they basically developed or formalized it very well, this idea, and that was the reason because they won the Nobel Prize. And I think that it was the article where they formalized that idea. So it was an article published by Econometrica in 1982, where that was an article very pioneer in formalizing this idea that there are real or structural reasons to explain the fluctuations of the economy. So I think that the key sentence in this introduction for me is this one. So that what I say, our approach integrates growth and business cycle theory. So the build a complete economic model that can integrate those two parts. And basically, they associate those shocks that are real. So they are not basically real, which means that they are not monetary or they are not financial shocks. So basically, something that is real or is on the real side of in the real sector of the economy. And of course, the 1973 so create the context favorable, favorable to this to that idea. Okay, and in the last minutes of this lecture, so I would like to bring your attention to the impact of technological progress on economic performance and on the economy. So we know that jobs, usually when we mention the jobs, we usually associate that with something negative, something that is the ultimate reason behind a recession or behind a crisis. But also, technology is also the main reason why we have economic growth. So we have different innovations or different technological progress that basically are the final reason or is the ultimate reason because since industrialization, we have experienced economic growth, at least in most countries across the world. So we have big innovations like the steam engine. So this is just to illustrate that. Also the railroad. So that technology implemented in transportation or the transportation industry, mainly in the railroad, for instance, create the condition for an important reduction in transportation costs and also have a positive impact on economic performance. We have major inventions or major innovations, so like all the digitation and the ICTs, the information and communication technology developed in the late 90s or in the early 21st century. This is just an original or a classic um, Macintosh to illustrate that innovation. So we have this idea that innovation is positive, is disruptive, and create possibilities for economic growth or create basically the conditions or are the reason for behind economic growth. Innovation is positive, but there are different kinds of innovation, and some of these innovations is what we call the general purpose technology. That's technology that are very disruptive and basically are at the core of eras of technology approach. So we have, for instance, the steam engine. So basically the most important innovation from the industrial revolution that basically I mentioned it minutes ago was implemented in different sectors, in transportation with the steam engine or with the steam navigation, also or also in stationary steams in textile factories, for instance. So have multiple or have several applications. Its impact of productivity is very important. Also, electricity is another example of general purpose technology in mass production, and of course, more recently, the ICTs, the information and communication technologies. So this is an interesting article by Gordon and Said from 2010 that basically they are trying to explain the renaissance of productivity driving growth in the case of the United States between 1995 and 2005. And he contrasts so the increase in productivity for the American economy with the evolution of the European or the largest European economies for the same period. And basically, what you can see is that productivity picked up in the case of the United States in those 2 years, and the main reason is because the consolidation of the information and communications technology. So that was the reason. So over the articles, basically is trying to compare why Europe failed in achieving the same level of productivity growth. And basically, the conclusion is that it was because the implementation of that technology into different sectors. So the most important one is the ICT use service. So basically, when he's contrasting the US with Europe, so he found that there is an important difference in that particular sector. So in that sector, the most relevant industry is retail. So the implementation of the ICT technology into the retail industry in the US, so basically explain mainly the difference between the American economy and the largest European economies. And finally, that would be like the last part of this lecture is that even that technological progress is very positive. So it increases productivity, it promote economic growth, also create disruption. And one of those disruption is, of course, those workers that are affected by technological innovation. So we have the famous case of Ludisen during the Industrial Revolution. So basically, this is the workers in the textile industry that they lost their jobs because the implementation of the new machines that save labor in the factories in the north of England. And basically, what you see is the opposition to the implementation of of machines like the spinning jenny or the different machines that were implemented in the textile industry. Of course, we have the sample of workers that lose their jobs when the adoption of computers and other innovations in the ICT industry were implemented after the 90s. So technological progress is positive, but also have certain groups that can oppose to that and also create some challenges. So, for instance, right now, a lot of people is worried about the evolution of artificial intelligence and how that will affect some occupations and the potential employment that can be created in that context. So, I think that that's also a sort of instability. Okay, that would be all in this lecture. So thank you very much, and I will be more than happy to take any question.
Thank you, Ivan. So to end the session, we have a couple of questions. The first one is, and I think you already did a little recap at the end of the lecture. Were there any crises prior to the industrialization of humanity, or is our crisis a product of the modern world?
I think that there have been crises or recession or periods where the economy didn't do as good as did before in any time in economic history. So even in the pre-industrial society, so there are some periods of recession, some periods of prosperity. Before industrialization, it was mainly because weather, because the agricultural sector was the most important one, as we saw for the case of England. But that was basically the standard for almost any economy or country or society before the industrial revolution. The intensity of the crisis increased in the 19th century, or we have in the 19th century a more banking panics. That's true. But it's also because we have a larger financial sector. So if you have a larger economy, so you have a higher chance to fall. And this is basically what happened during the 19th century. So in the 19th century, so you have the consolidation of globalization, more activity in in the in the financial sector, and of course, so you have a higher chance to experience a back impact. So, but the intensity of the crisis increased even further in the early 20th century with the Great Depression. This is what we mentioned that is what made the early 20th century different from the 19th century.
A second related question is, given that it appears that crises are inherently tied to markets, would you then say that markets are inherently unstable?
Yes, it depends how you define instability. So, um, you define instability like normal fluctuations or fluctuations that are within certain boundaries. Yes, markets are instability because is almost, I mean, we have developed mechanisms to mitigate that instability. So that was another takeaway from this lecture. I hope that that you get that takeaway that, for instance, the development of central banking is a mechanism to mitigate that instability. So the welfare policies is a way to mitigate instability associated with unemployment. So there are different mechanisms to mitigate that. But because we have technological progress, because technology is disrupted, because we have reasons for financial crisis like overvaluation from some investors about the potential return of commodity and new technology, there is an inherent instability until within certain boundaries. So what I would say is that in that sense, markets are unstable, but at the same time, market, because the benefits of the markets in allocating resource have also certain stability in the long run. So basically what you see is that Let me share my screen for a second just to close with that point. For instance, if you go to the series of the income per capita in the United States, it was at the very beginning of this presentation. Yes, you see instability in the sense that you have for certain periods a recession, decline, or even large depression like the Great Depression, but markets is stable in providing a long run stability in terms of economic growth. So basically, you don't see an economic collapse, even in under uh, complicated circumstances like the Great Depression. So I think that it depends how you see the question.
Okay, great. One final question. It's throughout history, what would you say is the most common type of shock given your categorization? Is it monetary or real shocks that were more common throughout history?
I think that real shocks, and it's just because monetary shocks only became more prevalent when we have a modern financial market. So, I mean, if we think in, for instance, in pre-industrial economies, yeah, bad weather, wars, also innovations, so all that. So they are source of real shocks.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. As always, this will be readily available on YouTube after a couple of hours after I edit it. And thank you. And we will have a discussion on the history of economic thought on economic stability in the markets by Vincent Carret on Thursday. Thank you.